Hello, my scholars and saints. I am back here talking about Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality. About 2 years ago, I did a video that you can watch on the second chapter of part 5, but I'm going to start with the chapter 1 because here I am. I'm going to talk about it in class tomorrow, so I'm going to have you help me reread it because it's 7:39 and I don't know, it's just late and I might get tired soon. Fall break went by, I wouldn't say really quickly. It was really nice, though. I mainly just woke up every morning, got my tea, my various drinks, and I was reading my books on angels just for the, high vibe nature. And then I really got into the gene keys. So I think when I did my TBR, I didn't know anything about them. And I'll have to talk about them more for sure. I didn't know they would align so well with my study on Carl Jung, in terms of shadow work and archetypes. And they also relate to the I Ching, the Chinese divination toolkit. I don't know what it is, but so I still need to research the I Ching, I guess. So I was reading that. I think only one day did I read the Zohar. There was just so much else to do, and then I was reading a little bit of Kierkegaard's Works of Love and slowly getting through Martin Buber's I and Thou, and then yesterday I just did Latin all day. So this week, tomorrow's Monday for me, Monday the 2nd, December 2nd. And so I have my Intro to Philosophy class in the morning, and my students are doing presentations. And then for my World Religions class, we are doing a unit on philosophy of religion and talking about Whitehead, and Steiner. And then I'm going to probably just work on Latin for as much of the week as I can, because I have a vocab test on the 4th due, chapter 11 homework on the 5th due. I still have to submit chapter 10 homework, which I'm finished with that, so that's fine. But I'm not finished with chapters 7 through 9 exam or chapter 7 through 9 workbook. I'm on the chapter 8 section, so I really need to work on that, but I let her know that I had to turn it in late. And then after that, I just have one more World Religions class on the 9th. And then my grades are due for the community college on the 11th. And then I don't know when my grades are due for the university, but I will figure that out. I'll get them in way before they're due. And then it is winter break for myself, and I'll probably do a therapy session at some point this month before Christmas and take Latin 2 next semester. Next semester, I'm teaching world religions at the university again, but this time just online. And then for my community college, I'm teaching philosophy of religion online. I'm teaching another Intro to Philosophy on campus again. So it'll be super, super exciting. And then, I don't know, just doing other, I'm going to see if my dean will let me teach alongside the 2 philosophy classes, 2 humanities classes, because I'm also signed up for 2 world mythology classes, but the rule has been in the past that you can only teach 2 sections two classes outside of the discipline for which you were hired. And I was hired in the English department. I want to switch over to the philosophy department, but there hasn't been like a call for instructors yet. So like full-time faculty, I mean. So yeah, so we'll just see. But yeah, trying to do a lot of inner work, but not, go into like a psychotic breakdown or anything. I did order, speaking of psychotic breakdowns, I did order Carl Jung's Red Book again. I had a copy of that months and months and months ago. I don't even remember. I think I took a picture and put it on Instagram, but then I had to send it back because I was like figuring financial stuff out, I guess. But yeah, I have a ton of Carl Jung books that I want to do a whole video on, but that'll be, I don't know, after tomorrow, because Sunday nights are just thinking about my busiest day, which is Monday. So all of that, just catching up with you all. I hope that you are all well, that you had a great fall break, and that, your December is looking good. Okay, so just a little bit about Alfred North Whitehead, if you don't know about him. His years are 1861 to 1947. He was an English mathematician, philosopher, and he went to Trinity College, and I think he also stayed on and taught mathematics. He co-authored the Principia Mathematica with his former student, Bertrand Russell. And so it was later in life that he transitioned to philosophy. And he actually moved to the US in 1924 to teach at Harvard. And then he started publishing works in philosophy such as Science in the Modern World in 1925, Process and Reality in 1929, and Adventures in Ideas 1933. So I've read Adventures of Ideas. It's a really good book. I would recommend it. So basically he because of his background, he is really good at forming a conversation between science, metaphysics, also religion, and philosophy. So Whitehead, just to give you kind of a summary of his ideas before we get into the book, he has a view of reality and God that is very dynamic, which is why, he calls his theology process theology. So it departs from traditional ideas of God, such as that God is just eternal and doesn't change, and he's omnipotent, and so he can do, anything he wants in the world. Whitehead has a more relational and co-creative kind of understanding of God, and God also evolves and is dynamic. So one of his first ideas is reality as process. So the universe is basically in constant change and characterized by becoming. So the universe is not static substances. So everything in reality, including God, as I said, is in a state of continuous process and evolution. So there's also this idea of God having two aspects or poles. So God does have an aspect, a primordial aspect that is eternal and unchanging, but also a characteristic of temporality, and God's able to be affected by the world. I kind of think of this as a Kabbalistic understanding. There's this idea that the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of God, or just like the divine, has to be activated through the activity of human beings. So basically, like, human beings have to awaken, and then this also awakens the power and the frequencies of the divine. So I think that's really interesting. And then there's this idea of panentheism, not pantheism, but panentheism, like you usually see it with hyphens, where the world is in God and God is in the world, but they're not, like, God and the world are not the same thing. So it's kind of, I see Whitehead as doing a very like both and kind of move. There's also this idea of God as a being that doesn't coerce or control anything, but influences through persuasion. So this makes God, very like relational instead of like throwing edicts down in a hierarchical fashion. And then also he has an idea or an emphasis on creativity. Creativity is actually like his ultimate metaphysical principle, and God is like the example of creativity, but not necessarily the source. And then there's also an idea of like interconnectedness. All entities in the universe are mutually influencing each other, and this includes God. So it's interesting that God is capable of being affected and responding to events in the world. And then we have the idea that along with creativity, each moment involves a creative synthesis of what has been into something new. So there's kind of like maybe even like a dialectic going on. And also this affects like Whitehead's process theology, affects his idea or how he would then respond to the problem of evil. So basically he sees evil as an unavoidable aspect of a creative process. So it's like sort of a risk of creativity, or it can also be when humans fail to reach their highest potential. And then again, like, God is not persuasive, but God serves as a lure or a tendency for every being to reach its highest potential. So God is both eternal and temporal, unchanging in the goodness and like an aspect of goodness, but yet is like responsive and evolving and living concerning the world. So I think it's really interesting, especially how the idea of evil is configured, and how creativity is the basis of existence. So let's get into the reading now. I've been waiting long enough, I think, and then maybe I'll say more on evil, or I'll make another video. So chapter 5, I feel like, doesn't really pick up until at least section 3, but I'm just going to read through all of it. The chief danger to philosophy is narrowness in the selection of evidence. This narrowness arises from the idiosyncrasies and timidities of particular authors, of particular social groups, of particular schools of thought, of particular epochs in the history of civilization. The evidence relied upon is arbitrarily biased by the temperaments of individuals, by the provincialities of groups, and by the limitations of schemes of thought. The evil resulting from this distortion of evidence is at its worst in the consideration of the topic of the final part of this investigation, ultimate ideals. We must commence this topic by an endeavor to state impartially the general types of the great ideals which have prevailed at sundry seasons and places. Our test in the selection to be impartial must be pragmatic. The chosen stage of exemplification must be as such to compel attention by its own intrinsic interest, or by the intrinsic interest of the results which flow from it. For example, the stern self-restraint of the Roman farmers in the early history of the Republic issued in the great epoch of the Roman Empire, and the stern self-restraint of the early Puritans in New England issued in the flowering of New England culture. The epoch of the Covenanters has had for its issue the deep impression which modern civilization owes to Scotland. Neither the Roman farmers nor the American Puritans nor the Covenanters can wholly command allegiance. They also differ from each other. But in either case, there is greatness there, greatly exemplified. In contrast to this example, we find the flowering time of the aesthetic culture of ancient Greece, the Augustan epoch in Rome, the Italian Renaissance, the Elizabethan epoch in England, the Restoration epoch in England, French and Teutonic civilization throughout the centuries of the modern world, modern Paris and modern New York. Moralists have much to say about some of these societies, yet while there is any critical judgment in the lives of men, such achievements can never be forgotten. In the estimation of either type of these contrasted examples, sheer contempt betokens blindness. In each of these instances, there are elements which compel admiration. There is a greatness in the lives of those who build up religious systems, a greatness in action, an idea, and in self-subordination, embodied in instance after instance through centuries of growth. I remember in my other video, I really loved that quote, sheer contempt betokens blindness. So I think that, there's an idea in the Adventures of Ideas where in each historical epoch, in each culture, in their own historical epoch, the story that's going to be told is simply the story of selection, of emphasis. And so I think what he's saying here is that, and so there's always more to the reality than that story that is told. And I think he's also just creating space in general for a hermeneutics of generosity, which I think is lovely. There is a greatness in the rebels who destroy such systems. They are the titans who storm heaven armed with passionate sincerity. It may be that the revolt is the mere assertion by youth of its right to its proper brilliance, to that final good of immediate joy. Philosophy may not neglect the multifariousness of the world. The fairies dance, and Christ is nailed to the cross. There are various contrasted qualities of temperament, this is section 2, which control the formation of the mentalities of different epochs. In a previous chapter, attention has already been drawn to the sense of permanence dominating the invocation, abide with me, and the sense of flux dominating the sequel, fast falls the eventide. Ideals fashion themselves around these two notions, permanence and flux. In the inescapable flux, there is something that abides. In the overwhelming permanence, there is an element that escapes into flux. Permanence can be snatched only out of its flux, and the passing moment can find its adequate intensity only by the submission to permanence. Those who would disjoin the two elements can find no interpretation of patent facts. So I'm going to box this part because I think that's really helpful. Just the idea that within one pole are the seeds for the opposite pole. It's it kind of reminds me of like the Chinese concept of yin and yang. The four symbolic figures in the Medici Chapel in Florence, Michelangelo's masterpieces of statuary, day and night, evening and dawn, exhibit the everlasting elements in the passage effect. The figures stay there, reclining in their recurring sequence, forever showing the essences and the nature of things. The perfect realization is not merely the exemplification of what in abstraction is timeless. It does more. It implants timelessness on what in its essence is passing. The perfect moment is fadeless in the lapse of time. Time has then lost its character to perpetual perishing. It becomes the moving image of eternity. I think that statement is so beautiful. I'm going to underline this. It implants timelessness on what in its essence is passing. So it's kind of a paradox. I'm just writing a note here in the margins that the pole contains the seeds for its opposite. So, as I said, the first two sections are kind of slow going, but I think it picks up here. Section 3. Another contrast is equally essential for the understanding of ideals. The contrast between order as the condition for excellence and order as stifling the freshness of living. Oh, I like that. I'm going to write order as shadow and light. Such good quotes. This contrast is met with a theory of education. The condition for excellence is a thorough training and technique. Sheer skill must pass out of the sphere of conscious exercise and must have assumed the character of unconscious habit. The first, the second, and the third condition for high achievement is scholarship, in that the enlarged sense, including knowledge, an acquired instinct controlling action. The paradox, which wrecks so many promising theories of education, is that the training which produces skills is so very apt to stifle imagination. I'm going to box that as well. It wasn't imagination. To stifle imaginative test. Skill demands repetition, and imaginative zest is tinged with, tinged with impulse. Up to a certain point, each gain in skill opens new paths for the imagination, but in each individual formal training has its limit of usefulness. Beyond that limit, there is degeneration. The lilies of the field toil not, neither do they spin. I think this is so interesting as well. And I think that is true for everything, that there's always a back and forth that's necessary. I'm going to write that down. Necessary is the back and forth. Like you have to have pauses. Like for instance, I've been doing sort of like this inner work, this spiritual kind of walk, trying to figure out what shadow work is and doing it. But I think when you are sort of really like going hard at your healing, like healing those wounds and figuring out everything, it can kind of be self-defeating, even though you need to go through some of that, but you also need to take a pause and kind of almost abandon it and see and kind of spend time like in joy and in light and in sort of playfulness, because I think like for instance, like you need to be committed and there's a certain level of seriousness, but also that seriousness can completely undermine the process, and basically like you can start missing the point of like healing and being spiritual, because you can get so wrapped up in like the goal, or the process of improvement, that you have to reconcile that with the understanding that some of the most enlightened high frequency aspects you can incorporate into yourself is surrender. So you always have to kind of go back and forth. The social history of mankind exhibits great organizations in their alternating functions of conditions for progress and contrivances for stunting humanity. The history of the Mediterranean lands and of Western Europe is the history of the blessing and the curse of political organizations, of religious organizations, of schemes of thoughts, of social agencies for large purposes. The moment of dominance prayed for, worked for, sacrificed for by generations of the noblest spirits marks the turning point where the blessing passes into the curse. So I'm going to write this down. It's kind of like the poison becomes, well, I guess it should be the other way around. The cure becomes the poison. Or then I think also like the hero becomes the villain. Like what's that phrase? Like if the hero lives too long, he becomes the villain. So at some point, everything always turns into its opposite, because it's just the concept of the middle way. You can be in one extreme, and so you need to work really hard to head toward almost the other extreme, but you have to know when to kind of pause or stop or reflect, so you don't actually go to the other extreme, which is just as bad. Some new principle of refreshment is required. So it's like kind of when you're trying to fix something, that's why, like, I guess you see in history this shift back and forth between more conservative decades and more progressive liberal decades. The art of progress is to preserve order amid change, and to preserve change amid order. Life refuses to be embalmed alive. Oh, that's really good. I like that. The more prolonged the halt in some unrelieved system of order, the greater the crash of the dead society. The same principle is exhibited by the tedium arising from the unrelieved dominance of a fashion in art. Europe, having covered itself with treasures of Gothic architecture, entered upon generations of satiation. That's good. Generations of satiation. These jaded epochs seem to have lost all sense of that particular form of loveliness. It seems as though the last delicacies of feeling require some element of novelty to relieve their massive inheritance from bygone system. Order is not sufficient. What is required is something much more complex. It is order entering upon novelty, so that the massiveness of order does not degenerate into mere repetition, and so that the novelty is always reflected upon a background of system. Oh, that's really great. I love that example. I feel like it will be kind of a foreign example for my students, but like the message of it is good. But the two elements must not really be disjoined. It belongs to the goodness of the world that its settled order should deal tenderly with the faint discordant light of the dawn of another age. Also, order, as it sinks into the background before new conditions, has its requirements. The old dominance should be transformed into the firm foundations upon which the new feelings arise, drawing their intensities from delicacies of contrast between system and freshness. In either alternative of excess, whether the past be lost or be dominant, the present is enfeebled. This is only an application of Aristotle's doctrine of the golden mean. Oh, I love that. Yes. The lesson of the transmutation of causal efficacy into presentational immediacy is that great ends are reached by life in the present. Life novel and immediate, but deriving its richness by its full inheritance from the rightly organized animal body. It is by reason of the body, with its miracle of order, that the treasures of the past environment are poured into the living occasion. The final percipient root of occasions is perhaps some thread of happenings wandering in empty space amid the interstices of the brain. It toils not, neither does it spin. It receives from the past, it lives in the present. It is shaken by the intensities of private feeling, aversion, or aversion. In its turn, this culmination of bodily life transmits itself as an element of novelty throughout the avenues of the body. Its sole use to the body is its vivid originality. It is the origin of novelty. So I think that's really interesting. I'm going to write down juxtaposition between chaos and order. And then also he's talking about the body here, which I think is really interesting, and also the present moment. I just really like writings that are paradoxical. I think that when it was Jung that said, when you come upon a paradox, you're pretty close to the truth. Okay, so there's just one more section. There was just 4 sections in here. It's a page and a half, so it's not super short, but yeah, I love this idea of like going back and forth. Okay, section 4. The world is thus faced by the paradox that at least in its higher actualities it craves for novelty and yet is haunted by terror at the loss of the past with its familiarities and its loved ones. It seeks escape from time in its character of perpetually perishing. Part of the joy of the New Year's is the hope of the old round of seasons with their stable facts of friendship and love and old association, yet conjointly with this terror, the present, as mere unrelieved preservation of the past, assumes the character of a horror of the past, rejection of it, revolt. To die, be given, or attain fierce work it were to do again. Each new epoch enters upon its career by waging unrelenting war upon the aesthetic gods of its immediate predecessor. Yet the culminating fact of conscious rational life refuses to conceive itself as a transient enjoyment, transiently useful. In the order of the physical world, its role is defined by its introduction of novelty. But just as physical feelings are haunted by the vague insistence of causality, so the higher intellectual feelings are haunted by the vague insistence of another order. Where there is no unrest, no travel, no shipwreck, there shall be no more sea. This is the problem which gradually shapes itself as religion reaches its higher phases in civilized communities. The most general formulation of the religious problem is the question whether the process of the temporal world passes into the formation of other actualities bound together in an order in which novelty does not mean loss. The ultimate evil in the temporal world is deeper than any specific evil. It lies in the fact that the past fades, that time is a perpetual perishing. Objectification involves elimination. The present fact has not the past fact with it in any full immediacy. The process of time veils the past below distinctive feeling. There is a unison of becoming among things in the present. Why should there not be novelty without loss of this direct unison of immediacy among things? In the temporal world, it is the empirical fact that process entails loss. The past is present under an abstraction, but there is no reason of any ultimate metaphysical generality. Why this should be the whole story. The nature of evil is that the characters of things are mutually obstructive. Thus, the depths of life require a process of selection. But the selection is elimination as the first step towards another temporal order seeking to minimize obstructive modes. Selection is at once the measure of evil and the process of its evasion. It means discarding the element of obstructiveness in fact. No element, in fact, is ineffectual. Thus, the struggle with evil is a process of building up a mode of utilization by the provision of immediate elements, introducing a complex structure of harmony. The triviality in some initial reconstruction of order expresses the fact that actualities are being produced, which, trivial in their own proper character of immediate ends, are proper means for the emergence of a world at once lucid and intrinsically of immediate worth. The evil of the world is that those elements which are translucent so far as the transmission is concerned, in themselves are of slight weight, and that those elements with individual weight by their discord impose upon vivid immediacy the obligation that it fade into night. He giveth his beloved sleep. In our cosmological construction, we are therefore left with the final opposites, sorrow and joy, good and evil, disjunction and conjunction, that is to say, the many in one, flux and permanence, greatness and triviality, freedom and necessity, God and the world. In this list, the pairs of opposites are in experience with a certain ultimate directness of intuition, except in the case of the last pair, God and the world introduce the note of interpretation. They embody the interpretation of the cosmological problem in terms of a fundamental metaphysical doctrine as to the quality of creative origination, namely conceptual appetition and physical realization. This topic constitutes the last chapter of cosmology. Okay, that's it. I love that, and I love that the title of this is Ideal Opposites, looking at flux and permanence. And it seems like he's saying that God and the world as a duality is like the least intuitive and the most interpretive, and I guess that would be true. It's more like conceptual maybe than intuitive, like experiential perhaps, but there has to be some level of intuition or experience to it, or I don't think we would have ever come up with the concept. So yeah, he's basically just talking about how opposites flow into each other and contain the seeds of the other, and that this is life, but then this also sets the stage for certain evils, like certain things to be seen as evil. So yeah, I don't know. But he's not really talking about like events that that are imbued with suffering. Like, I don't think he had. Did he have examples of that? He did, like in the beginning. I guess he was kind of implying it in the beginning when he was talking about like the history of civilizations. But yeah, let's see. I guess this might be a good time to go into like the idea of evil, since I was maybe just mentioning it, but I think, there's not really, there's probably a lot to say, but the main idea is just that evil is not necessarily like a metaphysical thing, but it's basically when harmony or balance is disrupted, and it could be seen as like misplaced creativity. And so, so basically God doesn't necessarily eliminate evil directly or try to do that, but God is just continually, naturally like working to integrate and transform discord into greater harmony, because it's almost like it's like a natural law. That's the natural tendency of living beings, to move toward equilibrium and harmony. So so God is like an energetic tendency toward beauty, harmony, and value, even in the midst of chaos and suffering. And chaos and suffering just, in a sense, kind of like happen. But there's also this like optimistic turn, because suffering and evil isn't necessarily lost. These experiences are taken up and into the evolving experience and redeemed in the ongoing process of creation. So there's like a continual transmuting as well, which I think like not everyone would, agree or take into account. It's a very like almost detached perspective of evil in a sense, and very optimistic. And I just feel like that doesn't always work when you're looking at, like historical things that have happened. Or maybe I'm just not evolved and enlightened to be able to accept that. But basically, like, I think one of the main problems in discussions of theodicy is that, if God is so good and God is all powerful, why doesn't God prevent evil? But that's, for Whitehead, that's not God's role. God's role is to help the world creatively respond to it, making the best possible outcome from every situation. And again, like moving toward harmony and beauty. So past evils are basically integrated into like this ongoing creative progression. So it's not necessarily that evil is undone, but it can be incorporated into new patterns of value and meaning. And I guess like when you're thinking about perhaps like childhood trauma or something, like that's kind of like what you have to do to grow past it. Or that's just what a lot of people elect to do, to move past bitterness and move into like forgiveness for self, to not like let anger, I guess, poison the well. So basically, redemption is a collaborative process between God and the world. So it's kind of like the meaningful sort of emphasis is what you do in the aftermath of suffering, what you do with the suffering. And it's also, evil is also somewhat a challenge to this sort of divine vision, because there is like an impetus toward harmony and beauty. So it does challenge the ultimate aim of like God or source or this like energy or natural law that's like not all of those words Whitehead would use. Whitehead would just use God, but like I guess if you're like interpreting it and trying to understand it and align it with like other philosophers and literature, you might like use different words. So it's more, so Whitehead is more interested in emphasizing freedom and creativity rather like deterministic control. And I think we're talking about Rudolf Steiner, and I think that Steiner really relates, like goes well into this, because he is arguing for the freedom of the human being, freedom that like requires inner soul work but can be developed. That's what I think is interesting about Steiner, is that your freedom and your free will are not necessarily promised to you, but they are inherent as a potential. So I think that's a really interesting way. And then thinking about like Simone Weil, since we're also talking about her tomorrow, she really does, talk about the dynamic between the world, the material world with all of its gravity, and then God, the supernatural, in terms of like light and grace, and how there's choice to like respond in more like, I guess, grace-oriented ways, and your soul fills up like an empty vessel in a sense. So there's kind of like this self-emptying. It's a little more, I think Vey is a little more like theologically traditional, but she still does like a cool nuanced thing with that tradition. So I guess I'll end it there. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. I might do another video on the second part, even though I did the video 2 years ago, but I just think that I've read so much in these past 2 years, and my thinking has just been developed, and so it might just be interesting for me to go over it again. So, and I don't know if I read it like word for word in my last video 2 years ago. So anyway, thanks so much. Put your comments and questions below. I love to read them and respond to them. And I have all of my comments on like review mode. So basically, they won't show up, like if you comment, they won't show up immediately unless I put you on like the approved list. And so after you like comment for a while and I just like get to know you, and then I'll put you on the approved list so your comments will immediately show up. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good evening.